All right, hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar in which we'll be talking about how to do modelling. Not this particular type of modelling, but a very similar and related type of modelling specific to the education sector. Now, modelling is one of the first tasks for those that are following something of an explicit instruction program or explicit instruction strategy. And in fact, regardless of what you're teaching students or how you're going about teaching students, modelling is a part of almost every different type of teaching strategy or teaching approach. Whether you're following more of a cognitivist or modern approach or a constructivist, which is the more trendy sort of approach these days, modelling is always an important part of any teaching activity. Now, modelling is very simple. Basically, all it means is that you're teaching students by first showing them how to do something. And that could be a skill, it could be how to apply or how to interpret knowledge or how to use knowledge. It could be being able to hand pass a football. There's a whole range of different ways in which modelling is used. It's not just used in sports activities or by doing those physical sort of gross motor or fine motor type skills. It's also used for reading, for maths problems and so forth. Now, if you look at sort of a standard lesson, and if you see my planning videos, usually 0 to 5 minutes is your sort of intro. And we won't go into what you do in an intro, and then your 5 to 10 or 6 to 10 minutes, that's normally what we call modelling. And then after that, you do various other things. So that's where, of a 40-minute lesson, 60-minute lesson, whatever, which will finish about here, that's where we do, that's where modelling generally fits in. Sometimes you'll have to remodel or do additional model down there as you show students more advanced things and so forth. And quite often modelling will involve a lot of other teaching and learning strategies. Now, this is the important part because everyone knows what modelling means, but there are some key aspects that are very important, all of which I've made some videos about, so please watch those because they are very central to the idea of understanding modelling. I'll just rub this off because it's not really that important. I just wanted you to see how it fits into a very standard universal teaching strategy. I'm going to do a bit of a brainstorm. No, I won't. I'll do a bit of a thing here. Now, the first thing is OTR, which stands for opportunities to respond. So pure modelling is when you're doing something on the board, for example, which is what is usually called a worked example, but you're also giving students plenty of opportunities to respond. Opportunities to respond basically means you're asking questions or you're asking for feedback of some description. Now, I've also done videos on question techniques. So have a look at question techniques. There's also another one relevant to that called Bloom's taxonomy. I hope I spelled that right. Bloom's taxonomy. Watch those two videos. They are very relevant to opportunities to respond. And as I've said in a lot of other videos, that opportunity to respond is central to student motivation, to students being able to memorize or to remember and recall at a later time the information and the skills in that activity, and also for them to be, I guess, on the ball so that they're thinking and engaged in that actual lesson. They're not wandering off, their brain and mind isn't wandering off in a different direction while you're talking about one thing. Because obviously when you get further down and they start practicing, if they weren't paying attention, then they're going to struggle a little bit there. So opportunities to respond are very important, and I would, at a guess, say that if you were demonstrating something to students, whether it's a whole class or whether it's 2 students or whether it's a single student, I would say that you're probably spending anywhere between 20 and 40% of your time asking questions, receiving feedback, bumping from student to student. So one student asks a question, you take that information and push it to another student and say things like, what do you think, or how would you add to that, or so on and so forth. Anyway, that's called opportunity to respond. Look up questioning techniques and Bloom's taxonomy because they're sort of related and quite important. Now the other one is your worked example. Worked example or worked examples is basically when the teacher or teacher aide or coach, trainer, whoever's going through it, on the board, usually on the board, sometimes using a PowerPoint presentation if you've been to seminars and things. A worked example means you're doing some type of example relevant to the student in a way that shows the working. So it shows the procedure, process 1, process 2, process 3, process 4, and so on and so forth. That's generally what we would call a worked example. Very important. Another aspect related to that is think-alouds. Now, think-alouds is related to the worked example, and what happens is as you're working through say a 5-step procedure to try and solve a problem or whatever, or to think through a problem or to present information, whatever your worked example is, at the same time that expert will be using think-alouds. Now we've all been on YouTube before, or we've all seen videos on Facebook or whatever. And when you're watching experts do anything, cooking something, for example, they're using a strategy that teachers refer to or educational professionals refer to as a think aloud. And a think aloud basically means that as they are going through and let's say teaching you how to kick a football or hand pass a football, they're going through the process of explaining what they're thinking, what their options are, what they can do, what they can't do, what can go wrong, what instances that stand out in their mind, little anecdotes, things like that. Any way that you can explain something so that students understand what's going on and what the process is. So if you are talking about something as simple as how to hand pass a football, then you might talk to students about the hand position. Because if you were to hand pass a ball, which is a simple hand pass, right? Something like this takes 2 seconds to actual model. The actual modelling part of that only takes not even 2 seconds. 1, 2, done. And that's doing it in slow motion. So even if you did it 3 or 4 times, it would only take 3 or 4 seconds, 10 seconds at the most. That's not really modelling. The definition of modelling includes all these other things, and I think aloud will be asking students or talking to students, those opportunity response, where do you think I put this hand? Do I put it here? Do I put it at the bottom? Do I put it at the side? Where does my thumb go? Does my finger go along there? What is the best way? Does anyone know the best way to hold the football so that we can handball it? And whereabouts on the actual football do we hit? Where's the impact spot? Is it at the bottom? Is it here? Is it here? Is it the side? And what happens if we do it at these different spots? What different impact does that have? So you could go through and talk about that and also give students those opportunities to respond. Now, another thing you could talk about is reasons for why we have to use a handball. So that can be, again, another opportunity to respond, and students might know the answer. You can go through and explain it. There's historical reasons. It's just there because that's just one of the rules. But there are reasons for why you would move the ball from yourself to a teammate using a handball as opposed to using a kick. Why can't we just throw it? And what happens if you do? So there are various different opportunities for you as the teacher or coach or whatever to seek opportunities to respond or to provide opportunities for your students to respond while going through a think aloud stepped process. Okay, so the next one that we want to talk about is what is called whole, part, whole learning. My writing has always been horrific my entire life, so I hope you can read that. Now, whole part, whole learning simply means that if you're going to model how to do something, you start with showing the whole way to do it. So you would start by saying, for a handball, you go, this is what a handball looks like. Boom. Once you've done that, then you move to the part. Now, the part is where the modelling, and you're spending 90% of your time. If you were teaching a student how to change a bike tyre, if you were teaching them how to write a paragraph, any of those different types of things, Whole is where you demonstrate it, normally at full strength. So you're demonstrating it at not full strength, sorry, full speed or normal speed. You might slow it down a little bit and explain some things as you go, but generally that whole involves demonstrating it from start to finish, and it gives students something to aim for, because there's nothing worse than looking at or listening to an expert for a long period of time where they never actually show you how to do something. And a lot of people do this naturally. If you're talking about baking a cake or woodwork or something, you will always see what the original or end result, not the original, what the end result looks like first. So they'll say, well, here's what the cake looks like, and here's how we go about making this, and they'll go through the process. And so that is the part. So if we're talking about a football, where to hold it, step 1 is holding it, step 2 is a stance of some description, step 4 is a follow through, so forth. So you'd go through and spend a bit of time explaining that. Back to the whole again. So that last little bit there is the same as that. Maybe if this one was at 90% speed or 80% speed, that one at the very end. Now that here is where students should be able to do it. So that's the student does that one, but the teacher, that pen's useless, does that one. So this takes, say, 4% from a time perspective, about 4%. This part takes, depending if you're doing an assessment or not, but generally that whole, I'm going to say 20%. And the reason for that is because you want to do what is called purposeful practice, which is the next thing I was going to add up. And I'll explain that in a second, because it doesn't technically belong under modelling, but it's an important point to put there. Because they will spend some time here doing some practice, doing the whole thing. So they'll spend, what does that work out to be? 76% of the time doing individual parts of it. So they'll practice one part, then practice the next part, then practice the next part. Now, for some things as well, like learning how to handball or football, doing it in parts is a bit tricky. This more so applies if you're modelling something like putting an essay together, because there are various different parts that make up. Doing woodworking, for example, there are various different parts. Learning how to fix something on a computer, learning a maths problem that has multiple stages. And that way you can practice things in parts before putting it together and being able to do it all in one go. So that part there is either practice. So that will be the practice. And this part here will be some type of assessment. Okay, so there are two aspects that go into there. I think maybe we're getting a bit too complicated with this whole thing at the moment. But either way, you start by demonstrating it, pure modelling, divide it up into small little chunks or different pieces, and the students either study it or learn it one little piece at a time. That could be over a period of a couple of months, or it could be a single session, and then it all comes back together at the end. So I like to think of modelling as being a part of, if you do that in a pure whole part whole sense, if you're doing modelling in terms of whole part whole, this is mainly the teacher doing all of this. So the teacher will demonstrate it as a whole, then they'll show and think through using all the different parts. So there's 4 parts, then they'll demonstrate it as a whole again to show how it all comes together. But whole part whole also works for students when you finish the modelling and you're going on and doing the rest of it as well. Okay, now purposeful practice, also called deliberate practice, is a part of modelling, because while you're doing your think-alouds, or your worked examples, which kind of go together, you're also showing students and telling students what you want them to concentrate on. So there will be probably, a good rule of thumb is 3 things that you want them to concentrate on. And while you're doing all your modelling work, that's what you're explaining and demonstrating slowly and showing them from different angles and so on and so forth. So that purposeful practice and having specific things to practice and to reflect on and to be assessed on and to look at and have a chat about as a whole class or whole group scenario is also a part of that sort of modelling process. Cool. Well, there are various other strategies that we can add to modelling as well. So another one is a KWL chart. which the easiest way for me to explain that is, well, probably the easiest thing to do is just to Google it. But basically, KWL charts, I've also got a video about KWL charts as well. KWL charts basically divide things up into what you know and what you need to know. So there's 2 or 3 different sections there, depend on the model you use and how you go about doing it. What you know, what you want to know, and then what you've learnt. And students fill that in. They start with that and they fill that in at the end. Another one that's really good is what we call an advanced organiser. ADV, let's just call it an advanced organiser. And normally when students are starting the modelling process at the start of, say, a lesson, the teacher will give them some type of advanced organiser. And there are various different types of those. KWL chart is actually one of them. That's probably one of the more famous ones. Another one is called a mind map. A mind map of some description. Brainstorm is another type. So any type of piece of paper or brainstorm or jigsaw or anything like that where students can start drawing and taking notes and making connections between things. And it gives them, these advanced organisers, give students, it's a type of scaffold that gives them a way to access the information that you're trying to get across. So they can start sorting information into different sections or sorting it into different processes and so on and so forth. Again, advanced organisers, we have a video on that one, so I'd recommend in watching that, because advanced organisers of various different types will become part of everything that you do. As far as teaching is concerned, it's a very central teaching strategy at all levels. Okay, now just quickly, modelling. We went through before where modelling fits. So you've got your little intro review at the start of a lesson, and then you go through and you do your worked examples or some type of modelling on the board. You're working through, you're giving students the opportunities to respond, you're using worked examples, you're doing think-alouds, whole part, whole learning as well. That leads to the next part of that sort of explicit instruction process. And that process normally then is, so number 1 is normally modelling. Number 2 is normally shared learning. Number 3 is normally guided. I don't know if you can see that, sorry. Number 4 is normally independent learning. And then number 5 is self-directed learning. So modelling is the very first scaffold. It's probably not technically a scaffold, but it's the first scaffold in the process of getting students from zero knowledge to being able to learn completely and utterly on their own with no teacher support whatsoever. Cool. So that is the basics of modelling and why it's important to the teaching and learning process.